thanks for joining me today. As we mentioned, my name is Mark Gray. I'm the Principal Product Manager for Terraform on Azure. My team focuses on the Terraform providers on Azure, and we'll talk a little bit more about my team in a minute, but I wanted to get started by setting the stage on kind of what we're going to talk about today. So the title of the session is What's New in Azure, but we kind of have a lot of things that we're going to cover. It's 30 minutes, so it's going to be tight, so I might go fast. But we're going to cover everything from kind of all of the different areas that we're focused on. And we're kind of build on what we're doing. So we have a lot of different features and products that we're releasing, or that we have released and are working on and stuff like that. But it all kind of works up to kind of one of the core problems that we're hearing from customers and we've heard from customers. So from a setting the stage perspective, I'll start with a story here. So a couple of years ago, I was at a Microsoft Ignite conference, doing the same thing that I'm doing now, talking about Terraform and things like that, manning the booth, talking to customers and all of those kinds of things. In addition to doing that, I wanted to take advantage of some of the other sessions that were going on. So I joined a session that was titled something along the lines of using Terraform in the enterprise on Azure or something like that. And Terraform was, obviously it is really popular now, and it was really popular back then. And about a third of the way through the session, it was a 70-minute session, so 15, 20 minutes into the session, I saw waves of people starting to get up and leave. And I was thinking to myself, what is going on here? I mean, people are really into Terraform. Why are they leaving? And me being an introvert, I did what was extremely uncomfortable for myself. I started following people out and introducing myself as Microsoft PM who owns Terraform and stuff like that, and trying to get some understanding of why they were leaving. And it really came down to, across the board, people were wanting to understand how to use Terraform at scale. So the session was titled Enterprise and Terraform, and they were going over how to write Terraform syntax and how to write modules and stuff like that. And people were like, I know how to do that. I don't want you to tell me how to do that again. Tell me how to use this thing at scale. So we'll talk about a lot of the investments that we're working on that kind of build up and allow you to actually use Terraform at scale in Azure, and kind of the investments we're working on there. So, sound good? All right. So my team, like I mentioned, I work on Terraform. We have an engineering team that works closely with HashiCorp, and we invest in not only the Azure ARM provider, but a bunch of other providers that we'll talk about in a minute. Our broader team actually works on Azure deployments in general. So anything you do to deploy to Azure from the command line. So ARM templates, Bicep, PowerShell, CLI, all of that stuff is what our team owns. So we want to make sure that whatever tools that you choose as a customer to actually do your deployments, that they work well, they're consistent, and those kinds of things. What I think this really, the point that I want to highlight here is, if you look across all of these things, the only thing that is a third-party product is Terraform in this list, and we treat that like a first-party product on the team. So it's something that we're highly invested in and want to make sure that you can be successful using Terraform on Azure. And as we, to kind of get started here, I want to have a video that we have from a customer that's actually been successful using Terraform on Azure, and then we'll kind of get into some of the products and stuff like that. So kick off the video.
Hi-Res Studios is a developer and publisher of online video games across all platforms. We've had about 120 million people play our games. That includes Smite, Paladins, and Rogue Company.
Rogue Company was way more successful than we ever thought it would be. We needed to meet the demand that it had. And so Azure Kubernetes Services let us dynamically scale our fleet up and down.
Once we were in AKS, it made sense for us to leverage configuration management systems, key management systems through Consul and Vault and Terraform itself to enable us to move as quickly as we wanted.
Vault makes it really, really easy to work with secrets and to propagate them out into the appropriate places and make sure that people don't have access to things that they're not supposed to.
I really like Vault. The integrations with the various authentication backends allow us to do just-in-time access to cloud providers, be it Azure or any of our internal stuff, app-based secrets and passwords, and the policy level that we get to control access to various things.
Terraform is really good at codifying your intentions and translating that into actual infrastructure. We know that every time we use an AKS cluster or an IP address or any sort of resource in the cloud, we know it was allocated with the exact specifications we need to do our jobs effectively.
We store it in a GitHub repo and we run a script to say, hey, Terraform, fix all this up for us, and it does that.
Consul plays a very important role in our solution. We use it as a storage engine to store the Terraform outputs about the Azure resources.
One of the problems that we run into a lot is we need to be able to spin up a machine that's ready to go. Packer solves that problem for us. And Packer allows us to predefine images that are usable in multiple locations with very simple command line. All the HashiCorp stack really integrates really well with each other, and it's great for us to not have to build that bridge ourselves, since HashiCorp's going through the effort of doing it for us. The faster that we can manage environments, it means the faster we can get builds out to people. It allows us to develop the games faster, is really what it means. I trust HashiCorp. Their stack is very reliable, it is very secure, and I can rely on it to fulfill my business needs.
Awesome. So one of the things I wanted to point out here is Hi-Res obviously uses Terraform, but it uses a lot of the other products from HashiCorp as well. But since I focus on Terraform, I just kind of focus on some of the things that they said there, and then we'll kind of build on that. So what I really liked was the comment that Justin had around Terraform codifying their intentions and translating that to the actual infrastructure. And as you may or may not know, I'm sure most of you know, the way that happens from a Terraform perspective is through the providers. And like I mentioned, we invest pretty heavily in the providers to ensure that your experience when you're using Terraform is what we usually refer to as a convenience layer. So you're not having to understand the underlying REST APIs or anything like that. You can actually use Terraform in a way that makes sense to you. And we really work very heavily on that to make sure that that's a good experience for you. And like I mentioned, we have the Azure M provider, but we have a lot of other providers for Azure as well. And most of the deck when I'm talking about the provider or Terraform in general, I'm referring to the Azure RM provider. But we have providers for Azure AD. So if you want to manage user groups and users and stuff like that, we have a Terraform provider for that. We even have providers for Azure DevOps. So if you want to stand up pipelines or projects or those kinds of things. And what I think is really interesting about that provider is you can actually use that provider to stand up pipelines that will actually run Terraform code to do your deployment. So it's a really holistic way of using Terraform to manage your infrastructure and stuff like that. Then we have Stack and the AZ API provider, and I'll spend some more time talking about the AZ API provider in a few minutes here. So as far as coverage and processes and stuff like that go, we have spent a ton of time making sure that new services and features and functionality, when they come out, we implement them and do that in the provider, in the convenience layer, as quick as possible, so that you have the access to those things as when you need them. From a processes perspective, we have made Terraform coverage. Like I mentioned, we treat it like a first-party process, and we have internal processes at Microsoft where services, when they release, have to go through and check off the boxes and those kinds of things. For a GA requirement, services need to provide PowerShell and CLI and those kinds of things, and they need to actually support Terraform now as well. So for a service to GA, it's required that they have Terraform support. So we work really closely with the service teams to make sure that their APIs are compatible with Terraform, and then we do that implementation and release it with their GA. So it's really, and we've talked to a customer earlier today that hopefully you all have seen it as well, but Early on with the Azure RM provider, when new services and features and things like that released, it was weeks or months or even many, many months for the new functionality to be released in Terraform in the provider. That has come down quite a bit, and it will only get better over time. So we are committed to making sure that you have that coverage, and you have that coverage at GA for these services. So one of the other things that we've done from a processes perspective is customers have given us feedback on kind of a pivot to coverage where when they try to use Terraform, they're going to deploy a VM, and they're working with the VM, and they're successful as they test it and do the POC and stuff like that. But then when they get into the real world scenario, they hit some features and functionality that they just not covered yet. So we have internal tools and things like that that we kind of track to make sure that we're not missing individual properties and stuff like that. So you get that full experience that when you start to use this thing, you're going to be able to do everything that's available in the API. So we're really proud of that, and it's hopefully resonating with you, and we're going to continue to improve that and get better with that. So now let's switch a little bit there. Like I'm mentioning, the Azure RM provider is getting better and better, and we're going to continue to invest in that. But we still have scenarios where customers want to use Terraform to manage Azure, but that support is not in Azure RM. And the primary scenario for that is preview services. So a lot of customers want to use services and features and stuff like that immediately when they come out. So private preview or public preview or what have you. The Azure RM provider is intended to support the GA functionality, and that's because of breaking changes and those kinds of things. When you have a public preview service, Azure service teams can have breaking changes, and Terraform does not like that at all. So what we've done is release the AZ API provider, and that allows you to manage those types of things. And we do that in a way that the name of the provider is AZ API provider, but it is a Terraform provider, and it's a full Terraform provider. So it supports state and all of that kind of stuff. And even though we've named it AZ API provider, because of kind of where it lives and what it does, you don't need to understand the AZ API, or I'm sorry, the Azure API to actually use the thing. We have done a lot of work to abstract it and make sure that it looks like Terraform and feels like Terraform and acts like Terraform. So a couple of things we've done from an ease of use perspective with the AZ API provider is we have Visual Studio Code extensions. So you get a language server and syntax highlighting and all of that kind of stuff. So you get a good experience on that. So you don't have to go looking at the Azure API documentation and stuff like that to understand that, so that you can use this provider. We've also, and I'll talk about this later, but we've also released documentation that documents the schema of all of the AZ API types. So you get a good understanding of what properties are available for the different types and what the values should be and all of those kinds of things. We also intend the AZ API provider to be temporary, if you will. So if you're using some functionality that's preview and you want to, or it gets adopted and used in the Azure RM provider, we want to give you a smooth path to actually move to the Azure RM provider. So you don't have to go blow this stuff away and then recreate it and all of that kind of stuff. So we've created a migration tool that allows you to actually migrate from the AZ API provider to the Azure RM provider. In a smooth way. It updates your HCL, it updates the state and all of that kind of stuff. So you should just be able to move right over to the Azure RM provider when it's supported over there. We have just released, so it's been in preview for since the beginning of this year. We've just released version 1.0 of this, and there's some new functionality that I'll talk about in just a minute, but it is a GA version of this provider, so you can feel free to use it in your production environments. It's supported by Microsoft, so you can call up Microsoft and get tech support with it and those kinds of things as well. So some of the new features that have been added to it are action resources. So when we initially released, we had resources and data sources where they supported the put and get and delete. So if you define these things, it's going to call put and update the properties on that. And if you move it, it's going to delete it and those kinds of things. A lot of APIs have other operations that you might need to call. An example of that, which I'll show in a few minutes, is if you create a VM and you want to start that VM, there's another post that you need to call to actually start that VM. And prior to this action resource, you didn't have a way of doing that. It would create the VM, and then you need to use some other method to go start that thing. This action resource allows you to actually access every endpoint in Azure, so you can actually manage anything in Azure as soon as it's available. So it's extremely powerful, and it allows you to do whatever you need to do. Mentioned before the documentation. So we have centralized documentation for the AZ API provider, as well as bicep and ARM templates and things like that. So you can very easily find it and understand what you can do and what properties you need and stuff like that. So the migration tool that I mentioned before, the only way to use it was to go to GitHub and download the binary that was appropriate for your operating system. We have released new packages, so a couple of Linux packages and Windows packages, so you can easily install that and use that on your system, so you don't have to go searching GitHub for the binary and then figure out how to set your paths and all of that kind of stuff. You can just use the package manager, install that, and you're off and running. The next two things are a couple of, I'll show some examples of these, but this is, the AZ API provider is a thin layer over the Azure APIs. So there's some things that the Azure M provider does that you don't have to worry about when you're using the Azure M provider that you will have to worry about with the AZ API provider. One of those things is if the API does not return a value, so if you set a secret and then you do a get, it's not going to return that secret for you. And instead of Terraform telling you there's a diff here because I set this value to X and now it's returning null, I need to change it. And getting into that kind of world, we're providing the ability to ignore the missing properties. So the provider is not going to get you in that endless loop of I need to change this all the time. And the other one is some providers are require you to do things serially. So if I have 100 rules that I need to set on a NSG, I can tell the resources themselves to actually wait for the other resources of this type to finish. So I'm going to set all those rules, and I know that they need to be set serially. I can use that locks property to actually have them do that. So it's pretty powerful from that perspective. And the last thing, we've done a lot of bug fixes and those kinds of things in this provider to make it easier for you to use. All right, so I'm going to do a demo here, not kind of on a live demo, but I'm going to actually walk through some of these slides and give you an understanding of what the AZ API provider is here real quick. So in this example, the container app has just been released. It's not supported in the Azure M provider yet. So we'll use the AZ API provider to actually manage the container app itself until it's actually supported in the Azure M provider. So it's essentially that preview functionality resource. So in this example here, this is just setting up all of the dependent resources. So in a container app, you need a log analytics and container registry, and you need to build that image and those kinds of things. So this is using the Azure M provider to actually manage those things that are exposed in the Azure M provider. Then you go ahead and use the AZ API resource. And a couple things just to point out here real quickly. This is kind of the typical, what you would see when you're looking at the AZ API provider. You have a type, and instead of having individual resources for each individual type, you have a generic resource, that AZ API resource, and then you have a type that you define, and each of those types determine what will end up in the body, and then you can provide the API version as well. So in this particular case, it's setting the container app, the managed environment. You give it a name, and then you set the parent ID, and that's another thing that's unique to the AZ API provider. And essentially, all resources live somewhere, either in a resource group or in another resource or what have you. So the parent ID defines where that thing lives. And then the bodies property has all of the properties for that individual resource type. And like I mentioned, we have extensions for Visual Studio Code, so you don't have to understand all of the properties that are in that resource. You get tab completion, and you can import the required properties and those kinds of things. So we give you a good experience there for actually managing those things. The last thing you can see here is the ignore missing properties down at the bottom. That ignore missing properties is for the shared key there, where when you define that shared key, it doesn't get returned. So you give it the ignore missing properties, and you don't get a delta every time you run the resource. And this next resource is using the AZ API resource again, and you can see that it has a different type there, and it's defining the container app itself, the version that you want to use to manage that thing, and then all of the properties for that resource. So it gives you a very clean way. All of this stuff gets saved in state. So if I go in and make a change and add a new secret to this, Terraform will come back like Terraform does and say, Terraform needs to be updated, or the container app needs to be updated because this secret has been added. So you get that good granularity in there that you wouldn't get with some of the other workarounds that you might use here. This is an example of the operations. So in this particular case, it's showing the Chaos Studio, and the operations needed to manage Chaos Studio. So in this particular case, if you're creating an experiment, you can actually create, update, and delete that experiment. But to actually run that experiment, you need to run the start operation down there. And that's where the action resource comes in. So you actually have access to actually kick that thing off and run the experiment. In this particular case, I'm going to show you an example of using the action resource to call some of those other operations. And in this example, it's going to be assigning a user assigned identity to AKS VM scale sets under the hood. So you can use the provider, so the Azure M provider, to actually stand up AKS. AKS spins up a VM scale set under the hood in a separate resource group. And then if you want to actually update that VM scale set, so it uses user assigned identity, you really have no way of doing that in Azure M right now. So the action resource will give you a way to actually update that. And we'll show you that here in a second. The one thing that I want to point out there down at the bottom is I kind of build the resource group where the sub-resources end up by using the pattern that AKS uses to actually create that resource group. So here are two action resources, and you can see the first one, what it's doing is asking the resource group. So the resource group that has the VM scale set in it from AKS, it's asking it for a list of the VM scale sets, and then it will return that. Basically, the response export value says return everything that's returned from this API. So you get all the details about the VM scale sets that are in that resource group. In this particular case, there's only one because of the configuration that I had. You can do some fancy stuff if you have multiple of them to identify the one that you're looking for, but in this particular case, there's only one. So then in the resource ID down below, I am calling or I'm using the ID of that VM scale set to assign or to update the VM scale set with the user assigned identity. And you can see that it's calling the patch method. So I don't want to reconfigure this whole thing with a new put. I just want to patch and add this user assigned identity so that I can manage that thing the way that I want to. So you really start to see with this action resource, the power that you have with it. A lot of these things will be abstracted from you. So in the Azure M provider, we would abstract this and make it easier to use. So it's a single call and it makes multiple APIs under the hood. But in the AZ API provider, that's exposed to you, and you have the power to do it. It's just a little bit more complex, if you will. So. All right, there are a bunch of questions here. I'm not going to go through these questions. Some of these I'm going to bring them up, and some of them might resonate with you. A lot of questions we've heard from customers through different channels. The one that I want to highlight here is the one on the right there, where we've been asked, is the AZ API provider going to change the priority of how we invest in the Azure M provider? The answer to that is absolutely not. It is a provider that is added to give you the convenience of being able to access things that are not exposed in the Azure M provider. But the majority of our time and our development, both on the Microsoft side and the HashiCorp side, is spent on the Azure M provider. So we're doing everything we can to invest in the Azure M provider and make sure that the features and functionality are exposed to that so you can actually use that. All right. So I will move on. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the Terraform export tool. So one of the scenarios that we've heard from a lot of customers is from consultants and things like that, is they go into a customer and they want to onboard that customer to Terraform. And the way that they approach that is all of that infrastructure that's already there, they just ignore and say, you manage that however you want to manage that. We're not going to try to onboard that because it's hard. So we're going to get you doing the good best practices using this new Terraform configurations and processes and stuff like that. And we're just going to kind of ignore that stuff and let that do whatever it does. The Terraform export tool gives you the ability to actually pull that existing infrastructure into Terraform and allow you to manage that. So it gives you the power to actually turn pre-deployed Azure infrastructure into Terraform HCL and Terraform State. So it gives you the ability to actually onboard not only new stuff, but brownfield stuff as well. So it's a really powerful tool. The tool is currently named Azure Terraform, and we have been talking with customers for quite a while on this tool. There are a bunch of different scenarios that they've given us that we hadn't thought about before, and we are going to be investing in this quite a bit more. We're going to be renaming the resource or the tool itself. We don't have a name yet. We're still working through internal processes on that, but we'll be renaming it at some point. We've got a lot of feedback on that name, and if you actually type Azure Terraform into Outlook or Google or anything like that, it actually auto-corrects it to Azure Terraform, which is kind of one of the reasons why we want to rename it. So, based on that customer feedback, we're adding a bunch of different modes to make the scenarios that the customers have called out easier. So modes and parameters and experiences and stuff like that to kind of improve that so it's easier to use and kind of targets those scenarios that we have heard from customers. We'll continue to get feedback on this tool. And if you use the tool, definitely open issues on it and provide feedback, and we will address those things. I do want to highlight, I'm not going to dive into the Azure Terraform tool. Stephen, who's up front here, has a hallway track tomorrow afternoon that I would invite you to go check out. He'll go into the details of what we're doing there, what the new parameters are, how to use it, and those kinds of things. So it's something that we're really excited about, and I invite you to go check out the new stuff that's coming there. The next thing that we're doing is working on Azure verified modules. So building on kind of what a customer's looking for when they start to scale, they need repeatable patterns, and we're working on building modules that customers can use and make sure that they're up to date and things like that. There are a bunch of modules, so I'll jump into the slides here. We have modules in the registry right now. Those modules are, how do I put this lightly? But those modules there are a bunch of issues with the modules where some of them are not maintained, some of them are not kept up to date, some of them are duplicate of other modules and things like that. And what that results in, from what we've heard from customers, is they don't rely on those. They're just going to build their own modules. And even that is hard because then they need to maintain those modules. So we're going to invest in those modules and make sure that we have a good set of modules that customers can rely on, have a central pipeline that those modules run through to make sure that they're up to date and there aren't breaking changes in them and things like that. So really get to a point where you have a set of modules that make your life easier to actually use Terraform on Azure. We have a pipeline that we have created for that now. We've run the AKS module through that, and we'll continue to expand to improve that pipeline and continue to onboard modules in there and highlight those and blog about them and stuff like that. All of this stuff will be open source, and we'll accept contributions to those as well. So if you have modules that you want to contribute and then have us own going long term, we will do that as well. So we really want to make this useful to everybody. One of the other things that I wanted to highlight there is with the modules, there are a lot of repetitive modules, including the internal tools that we have built at Microsoft. So CAF and Azure Landing Zone, like I mentioned before, have their own versions of modules. And the idea with these verified modules is that those Uber modules will take advantage of these modules as well. So you'll have essentially the ability to use one set of modules, so you don't have N different modules all from Microsoft, essentially. And I will go through the Azure Landing Zones, which really gets you to the point where you can use Terraform at scale. But I'll go through this real quickly because I know I'm really short on time here. But we do have a concept of Azure Landing Zones. It is built based on kind of best practices and designed to be used at scale. So it's a conceptual architecture, and it's, as you can see here, I'm not going to go through all the details, but it's big and complex. And you can imagine if you wanted to go implement this using Terraform, it would take you months to build this out and test it and make sure that it works and stuff like that. So we do have, sorry, going the right way here. We do have accelerators for the landing zone. There's a portal accelerator, as well as a bunch of the other different languages here. There are ARM templates, Bicep, and Terraform. So we do have accelerators for Terraform as well that give you the ability to very easily deploy these landing zones and get up to speed. And they are modular as well. So you have the ability to, if you just want to deploy part of that conceptual architecture, you can do that using the modules and then grow out as you need to there. So it's really powerful and allows you to take advantage of some of the best practices and things like that we have found through working with customers like yourselves. All right, the last couple of slides here real quickly. Wanted to touch on what's next. So here, like I mentioned, the API coverage, we're going to continue to invest in the Azure M Provider and get the new features and functionality out there as quick as possible. We are working on improving the authoring of the Azure M module, so making sure that it's easier and quicker to actually implement those Azure RM resources. We're doing that in cooperation with the HashiCorp folks. We are going to invest more in the verified modules. We have the pipeline, and we'll start to onboard more and more modules there. We have a community. So you saw on your seats, we have a community that we're wanting to build, and we invite you all to join that community. And what we're looking for there is feedback from you on what we're doing, as well as kind of help us set our direction for things to invest in going forward and stuff like that. The last couple of things, I think I've talked about most of these things. The AZ API provider for 0 day, we're going to continue to invest in that. Adding things like data plane support and those kinds of things to make sure that you really can do not only control plane, but data plane and stuff like that. And then documentation. We really need to improve our documentation and make sure that you have the information where you're looking for it and that you can be successful using Terraform on Azure. All right. With that, I'd like to thank you for joining me and hearing about what we're doing from a Terraform